Today we're checking with our neighbor and my pal, George Goehl. George is the executive director of People's Action. That's one of the nation's largest social change organizations. The People's Actions Network stretch from coast to coast. They employ more than 600 organizers and over 1 million volunteers. George and People's Action have just launched the To See Each Other podcast that examines their rural and small town activism. So, how are you holding up?
I mean, all in all, pretty good, considering everything. But it does seem like you get a gut punch every time you start to sit down at the fire or something at night. You get a gut punch. So you just got to kind of be ready for those, I guess.
Man, it's wacky. I thought I'd lived through the fire and lived through the flood, but I had not lived through this.
Right, exactly. So it's just tapping into some new resilience skills. I'd say that, yeah.
So, People's Action is a huge outfit, and you guys have worked in a lot of places around the country. I was inspired when I found out that you came from a small Indiana town and that your background was rural. Tell me a little bit about growing up in Indiana. Everybody in Kentucky knows people from Indiana. They can shoot and they can block out. That's what we know.
And they probably lived in Kentucky before they came to Indiana.
Maybe.
Yeah. Tiny little town, was doing fine. We lived next to the lumberjack Otis and his wife Flossie. My mom always thought he was trying to fell a couple of trees on our land, and then across from the county dump. But it was great living.
So tell me a little bit about your journey from playing in the creeks and to being the executive director of one of the largest social action groups in the country.
Yeah, well, we lived in Medora, then we moved to Nashville, and then at a certain point, my parents split up and we moved to Bloomington, Indiana. And, and both Medora and Nashville were, 90-some% white towns. And then we moved to Bloomington, which was a college town, which to me and my brother might as well have been New York City. We had a chip on our shoulder the minute we got there. But we ended up going to university school, they called it. And it was across the road from international student housing for Indiana University. So international students who moved over to do, probably in many cases, graduate degrees and had their kids with them. That's who I went to school with. And so I went from riding, 3-wheelers and mini bikes through the woods on Greasy Creek to suddenly my best friends were from Zimbabwe and Nigeria and Malaysia. And it didn't take long to figure out that they also felt like outsiders and had a little chip on their shoulder too. And people I didn't really know I talked funny until I got to Bloomington. I'd say "warsh" and "crick," and that wasn't how people said it in Bloomington. And people made fun of how the international kids talked too. And so that's who I ended up being friends with. I actually ended up, my first organizing job was organizing myself and that group of kids onto a basketball team to play what I thought were the rich kids at recess. We lost 31 recesses in a row before we started to get it together. But now that I'm older, I was like, damn, I should have organized a soccer team. We would have been winning from day one, but I didn't, I'm from Indiana, like you said, didn't know better.
So, and then all of a sudden you're doing direct action organizing, you're working with homeless populations. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I ended up, in trouble and struggling out of high school, went to a soup kitchen to eat. And at some point, actually pretty soon, I noticed people were volunteering. If you ate there, you'd still be like, I'm going to grab the trash and throw it out on my way out, or I'm going to grab a mop and help. There wasn't a big kind of delineation between who were the people serving the food and who were the people eating the food. So I started to do a little bit of that. And very long story, but somebody gave me a job. They gave me a job there washing dishes, and I did that for a while. And I eventually, got a real job, not a real job. That first job that somebody was kind of paying me under the table to wash dishes. And then I got a real job there and got very into the soup kitchen, and really kind of got on back on my feet. And 3 years into it, and I was really proud of what we were doing, thought we were doing some of the best work in the world. I looked up and I was like, wow, this is like basically the same group of people eating here as the first day I got here. And so I went from thinking we were doing the best work in the world to realizing like nobody'd starved on our watch, but also like nothing had changed. The reason people needed to be at a soup kitchen had not changed. And so I found, I mean, I literally around that time went to a bookstore and found Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and read that. And I was like, oh, there's a different way to do it. Started organizing out of the soup kitchen and public housing, at the homeless shelters. And then eventually people got word of it in Chicago, and I got recruited up in Chicago is where I got more training. And that was with what was National People's Action, now People's Action, and long road from there. And I eventually became the director, and that's how it happened. Yeah. I guess what I always think about is that moment of going from doing what, social service or charity, which is good work. Like it's work that needs to be done, to being like, oh, there's something more structural here that's got to get fixed, which I didn't have that analysis growing up. Like then you start to be like, so I feel like what we're always doing is like, what is the more structural fix? And so both what's more structural that's got to get addressed, and what's the thing that nobody else wants to do that's got to get addressed. And I think that is how we kind of guide ourselves and try to figure out like what's it going to take to like create the level of change that people need and deserve. And I think People's Action, it's built into the DNA now. We're just constantly searching for that, which was part of what led to the rural. In 2016, we started to pull together people in the People's Action family to talk about like, what would it look like for us to make a more concerted investment in rural? We had, rural groups inside of People's Action, and like very rural, like Iowa CCI and others, but also rural organizing within the states that we did. But to say that it had been a concerted, heavy investment over the last 5 or 6 years, kind of pre-2016, would not be true. And so we're like, what would it look like? And what would it also look like to name, we're going to go into, and do some of this organizing in areas that are real white. And because, like a lot of people maybe didn't want to do that. And so we looked at that. So we started mapping that out in 2016, and then in 2017, two things happened. One, a lot of folks who'd grown up rural and moved to big cities, like literally right after the election, started calling and saying, I want to move back home. Can you help me figure this out and do organizing? And so we had a little mini migration back home, and that we tried to help facilitate. And we didn't really worry about whether those were the most strategic spots or like people are hurting in all these spots. We're going to help make this happen. And then we started with the notion of listening, that like, and any even funding we raised, we said the only two things we'll commit to is going to listen to a lot of people and telling you what we heard. We're not going to go try to mobilize people on some issue that was cooked up by philanthropy in some, fancy office building. And so we went out, we did 10,000 conversations on people's front porches, outside of soup kitchens, community centers, places of worship. And we asked people what issues they cared about, what they saw as the solutions, instead of us like kind of projecting our solution on those issues. And then lastly, kind of who and what they saw as responsible for the changing conditions in the community. And first, it's not going to surprise you, but a lot of people said, you know what? Nobody's ever asked me before. And other people were just like, I think people just really appreciated being asked. And then
there's a transaction, right? Of
right.
knocking on doors, meeting people out on the street, having that conversation. There's a moment, right, where you're meeting each other, you're learning from each other, and it's got to be a little frightening, right? That moment. Tell me about what you were seeing there.
I mean, I really saw people I totally know the anxiety and the concern you're talking about. I think just almost across the board, everybody was just glad to be asked. And then we did what good organizers do. We actually worked on the things people brought up on the doors. We didn't, go, well, that's cool. You said X, Y, and Z, but we got some funding to do this, or we think this is the issue. And so if people said it was opioids, we worked on opioids. If people said it was a factory farm, we worked on factory farms. If it was healthcare or rural living wage, whatever it was, we did that. So everything we did all across the country was very different. And then we won stuff, like we won on those things. And then people were like, wait, this this is working. Like, and I mean, this is basic organizing. You ask people what they care about, you work on those things, and then you deliver tangible stuff, and people are like, hey, this is working. I'm going to keep coming. I'm going to bring some of my friends, and people in a lot of communities that had not worked together across race were suddenly in a room together, and that was beautiful. And sometimes it was really hard and painful, but it was progress. And then I would say something kept happening that we had to deal with which didn't surprise us, that a lot of folks were like, I'm all in on the organization. I'm coming to the actions. I can't believe we stopped a factory farm or won this rural living wage. And like, I just can't get with some of the stuff I hear around here around immigration. It's just not like how I think about things. And so we took that seriously. We started we moved to this deep canvassing model. And we did that in 3 states, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And we did some kind of pre-polling and post-polling. And it was a 20% increase in support for being more welcoming of undocumented immigrants, because we actually engage people in a conversation. And one thing I'll just say real quick, like what would happen, I went out and canvassed in all 3 of those states. A lot of times people will be like, you know what? 15 minutes into conversation, they'd be like, you know what, come to think of it, everything I think about immigration, I learned on the TV. Like, I don't know any immigrants, or like, it's not based on any lived experience. And the other thing people would come to their own conclusion on, we wouldn't say this, it'd be like, wait, there is a villain in the story. There is a reason that things are tough here, but it's probably not the 5 migrant families that moved into the county or whatever. But all of that based on like a respect for people and their story and how they came to understand the world the way they do. I think there's a lot of nuggets for how we might move forward as a country if we could figure out how to listen and be more curious with people.
It seems like what we're really good at in this country is making people mistrustful of each other. I wonder what your thoughts are about how you build trust in communities, and how people begin to find common purpose with folks that they saw before but didn't really know.
Yeah, I do think it starts with listening, and I think all good organizing always starts with listening versus selling. I think it's like working on the issues that people care about, not the issues somebody else cares about, and then moving into action and kind of into the public arena together. I feel like there's nothing else that builds trust in teams better than, we're going to hold this public meeting with the elected official. We're going to do this little protest around the, fracking company or whatever it is, and we're going to do it together, and we're going to come back and debrief. And then we're going to create safe enough spaces to talk about the things that have divided us up until now and why that is. And also hold each other with some sense of like, whatever you think and however you got here is like, there's a story behind that, and I want to understand it. I'm not here to judge it. I want to understand it. And I think the more we can do of that, I think we're in a great reckoning. Like, I think the next 30 years, I think we're going to come out in a really beautiful place and really have reckoned with a lot of the history of this country. I feel very positive that's going to happen. The question for me is, how much carnage is there going to be along the way? And I think we got to do organizing that pulls as many people along in creating whatever is going to be the next America. And I think there's some nuggets in this deep canvassing, listening, curiosity, seeing each other that'll get us to the other side. So
on this idea of safe space and carnage,
safe space and carnage. Nobody owns that website.
So when anybody would ask me, how to approach rural communities or what to do, I always said, touch somebody on the shoulder, buy them a bowl of soup or let them buy you a beer, make contact. And it's like, now we live in a world, if you touch somebody on the shoulder, you'd be up on charges, right? So how in the world do you organize in a time of the plague, in the sickness?
Yeah. We've been doing these COVID checks since COVID happened, and calling, thousands of people up each week and actually having a conversation around how they're doing. And really interesting, people will always be like, they don't know the person on the other end. So this is like organizing new people. People will be like, I'm fine, I'm doing fine. And then the canvasser will say, I'm not doing fine. And then they'll explain how they're doing fine. And the person on the other end is like, you know what, I'm not doing fine either. And we're finding people are way more likely to answer the phone in this context that we're in, not surprisingly. So that's really working. And just, it's a kind of another expression of deep canvassing. And then it's taken some work to figure out, Zoom and conference calls with, many of our members. I remember talking to one of our local directors, and they're like, y'all are talking about Zoom and virtual organizing, all that stuff. Like, it's going to take a month to get my members to learn how to put the mute button on. Like, it's just not a thing that people need to do in their lives. And so we've been, figuring all of that out. But we've been organizing a lot of Zoom spaces where people are being vulnerable around what they're up against in a way that, at least, I don't know what it's like in Kentucky. I'm guessing the same, but like being vulnerable wasn't like something we were taught a lot about, or I think of it as a kind of radical countercultural thing. But I think people are, there's an openness to it right now in a way that is new. And so creating spaces where people can be like, you know what, I am struggling.
Do you feel like you're learning things that you didn't expect, that the organization is growing in ways you didn't expect it from the rural work?
We wouldn't be doing this. This deep canvassing is one of the most, we're going to do this on everything we do. This notion of going into people and to talk to people and to listen to people and be curious. I mean, organizers are always curious and always start with listening. But the deep canvassing, I think, is really taking us to some new spiritual level. And like, I'm not writing anybody off anymore, because like, people are, even if we don't agree at the end, people are engaging me in some deep way. In this podcast, To See Each Other, in the first episode, we focus on Michigan, where the deep canvassing is happening. And actually, the canvasser is transforming people on the doors, but they're also kind of going like, wait, I'm not paying the same level of respect to my parents who I disagree with on things. And so I think there's some truth in all of this that we now apply to everything we do. So I would see that would be the biggest impact on us. And we feel like on rural, we're just getting started. Like, it's because you know better than anybody how long the disinvestment in rural has gone on. So you don't fix this in 4 years.
Well, I'm very, I've enjoyed the podcast. I've enjoyed listening to your experiences in rural and kind of the journey, and you being kind of transparent about what you expected, what you were learning. And then, the other, you've been sharing your manual, your organizing documents about what your approach is. So it's been interesting to put that out in the public discourse for a way that other people can see some value in interacting in rural communities. Maybe people who wouldn't have thought it was worth the candle.
I mean, the main purpose of the podcast, To See Each Other, was to disrupt this notion that I think is largely urban and largely very blue places, that we can write people and places off. That is the number one goal of this project. And so, we want rural folks to listen to it, and that would be great, but we are trying to get urban, blue, whatever you want to call folks, to like reconsider this notion that you can just write a bunch of people and places off. That's the goal. And early indications are the folks in those areas that are listening are like, damn, I did not know any of this. A lot of tears and emotion and people saying it's challenging for them. And we feel like that's a good sign.